This is a very old phenomenon. It's been with us since long before the Point Pleasant sightings of the 1960s. If you look at the beliefs and mythologies of different cultures around the world, you will find traditions of anthropomorphic winged creatures everywhere. There are cave markings dating back to ancient France. Visual representations also come from Egypt, Sumeria, Assyria. There are two ways you can look at this. If this is a purely cultural phenomenon, then it's clearly one that we've evolved with over tens of thousands of years. If that's the case, then of course we're still seeing winged humanoid type creatures in our skies. Equally, if this is supernatural, a metaphysical construct, then it would also make sense that humans have been experiencing this for millennia. Ken Gerhard in Mothman, Sightings and Investigations of the Iconic Flying Cryptid by Richard Estep and Tobias Wayland.
Every culture has its ghosts, its legends, its mysteries.
From UFOs to haunted houses, psychic visions to cryptids, we explore the stories that defy explanation and what they reveal about what it means to be human.
I'm Chris Daly.
And I'm Ryan Geckner. We're anthropologists asking big questions about belief, experience, and the unknown.
This is Beyond the Human. Welcome back to Beyond the Human. Today we're going to delve into Mothman and other winged humanoids. And as you heard in the opening quote, this is not something new, and this is not something that started in Point Pleasant, even though that's what we all think of when we hear about Mothman.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go all the way back because we're anthropologists. So we're going to go
In case you
way
didn't
back.
know.
Right? We're going to go way back to prehistory and kind of take a look first at where might this come from. So winged humanoids are pretty common around the globe. This is not one particular location, but around the globe in folklore and in picture. And so they're described everywhere, going all the way back to the Upper Paleolithic. So Ryan, do you want to take us through some of the early evidence?
Yeah. So if we put Mothman in this larger category of winged humanoids, then this phenomenon has evidence that is very old. So just to give you a few examples, there is some rock art in Gobustan National Park in Azerbaijan that is a site that includes rock art for a period of 40,000 years. So this is like from Upper Paleolithic art all the way through to medieval art, contemporary stuff. There's things in there that we can cite as like Roman and all of these things. And there are depictions of this person, and we'll be sure to link some photos in the show notes of these because it's similar to some other rock art in other locations around the world at very different times. And essentially what we're talking about is it's a person, and it looks like just a standard person with what appear to be wings coming off of maybe the shoulders. And of course, some of this is up to interpretation, as much of rock art is. But it's interesting because we see this same figure or very similar figures in other examples of rock art. And so we can look at a cave in Japan called Fugope that has art dating from around 100 to 400 CE. And that art or those depictions look almost identical to what we see in Gobustan National Park. And even in the United States, in 9 Mile Canyon, which is known as the world's longest art gallery. So this is a big petroglyph site in Utah with over 10,000 images of all kinds of things. So we're talking about images from Ute peoples and their ancestors ranging in dates from 950 all the way to the 1800s CE. So there's things that are historical in there as well. And these three sites in particular have this image of a person with wings that looks like, or doesn't have much reason to look the same, right? And we'll talk a little bit later about kind of some of the pitfalls of making comparisons like this because it's very easy to conflate meanings and interpretations without having the sort of full cultural context. And when we have rock art, we often don't, particularly when it's as old as the Upper Paleolithic. We just know that it's old and that somebody drew it. And we don't really know why they drew it or what it meant most of the time. Lots of people speculate about it, and there's a whole, subset of archaeology to understand this, right? But it's interesting to note that, when we think about Mothman, I think, for me in particular, Mothman is kind of one of the big cryptids, and we're going to play with the idea of whether or not it's a cryptid in this episode. But we tend to default to the original Mothman story in the 1960s in West Virginia, and we're gonna dive into that in this episode. But we wanted to kind of situate it in this bigger conversation of the phenomenon of human beings at all times and pretty much all places around the world depicting entities that look somewhat anthropomorphic but also have wings, right?
And here's a question I have about those pictures.
Yes.
When we talk about Mothman, we don't describe Mothman as really completely human shaped, particularly
Right.
the head
The head,
neck
yeah. Mhm.
area. So when you look at those pictures, what does that area look like? I mean, does it look
Yeah.
more human? Are there differences?
Right.
What do you see in these older pictures?
Yeah, I mean, some of the three from the Gombostan and Fugope and 9 Mile Canyon, they look to be more of a standard sort of human with wings. The head looks to be distinct, unlike what it's mostly described in with Mothman sightings. But there is one, and I believe it's the one from Fugope, that really gets us as close to a Mothman-esque look as out of those three, right? The one at Gomustan and the one at 9 Mile Canyon, I think, look pretty distinctly like a person with wings. But yeah, it's definitely up for interpretation for sure.
Because that's definitely it's an interesting piece of the
Hmm.
Mothman legend is kind
Yeah,
of what this thing looks like.
yeah, and as we talk a little bit more about some of the more contemporary sightings and the idea of Mothman being an example of these winged humanoid entities, the descriptions start to kind of float away a little bit from what people initially describe as Mothman. So we'll leave that up to the listeners to decide what you make of that.
Yeah, or maybe we're talking about different species of winged
We could
humanoids. I
be. We
mean,
could be.
that's possible.
Yeah, certainly could be. And that's not the only sort of art depiction that we see either. So you often see depictions around in and around Mesopotamia of winged humans. There are some really popular, not necessarily popular, but really well-known examples of Assyrian winged genies or jinn, and they're from around 870 BCE. So we've got, a wide spread of time where we're seeing humans depict people or seemingly people with wings, right? And so then if we kind of switch gears a little bit to talking about some more historical examples, and when anthropologists say prehistoric versus historical, that's actually a really important distinction. So I am going to have a brief aside about that. So when we say historical, we mean there are records that we can look at that tell us what this thing is that we're looking at. When we look at things that are prehistoric, typically that means we don't have anything to reference in terms of telling us what we're looking at. Now, that gets a little wishy-washy when you start to talk about things like oral tradition and things like that, but that's kind of a separate discussion.
Well, and that also pulls in the just because it's written down, what does that mean?
Yes, 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 yes. Yeah, I mean, my whole master's thesis was about that. So, like, the question of like whether or not when we write something down, that means it always means the same thing to every person who reads it forever and ever. We know that's not true.
Well, and who wrote it and what were
And
their
what did they think?
agenda
Right, exactly. Why did they write it, and why did they write it the way they did? We can talk about that for days, really. But the point is here when we switch to talking about historical examples, these are examples that we can look at where you can go read the thing, right? So we talk about like Greek harpies and sirens. These are described in various epic poems and depicted in art, often as birds with the heads of women. So this is getting us almost closer to the way that Mothman is
a
described,
little bit, yeah,
bit,
a little bit.
but not entirely there. Also, something is interesting to me that I learned while researching this episode is that depending on the period of Greek history and who was writing it, they're described sometimes as beautiful or completely hideous. And that's, I think, somewhat interesting. There's
Did
a
that
difference.
respond to what they were doing?
Not no, not what I was reading. No.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so
That makes it
there's
way more interesting.
yeah. So there's just some people during certain periods were like, okay, well, sirens and harpies are beautiful, and other times they're not. And some big examples that you may be familiar with that use these are like the Greek poem Argonautica. So if you're familiar with Jason and the Argonauts, that's that story, as well as Homer's Odyssey, which we probably all had to read in high school at some point.
Most of us read the Iliad and the Odyssey.
I don't think I ever had to read the Iliad.
Really?
No, I don't think
That's
so.
about the wars.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm familiar and I know the whole Achilles thing and all that, but yeah.
Anyway.
And so we have, those examples, but we also have, examples of Abrahamic angels. So these are angels that come from the Abrahamic faiths. So this would be Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. If you weren't aware, those are related. And some of the key examples that we can find in those come from the Bible and the Quran. Interestingly, Jewish scriptures don't always, well, the Jewish scriptures that aren't shared with Christianity, let me start there, don't often have depictions, or the depictions they have are very different. And so, first and foremost, we have, in the Quran, it refers to them as messengers with wings, 2, 3, or 4 pairs, and that's from Surah 51, verse 1.
And what's really important about that for this particular episode is the idea of messenger, a winged humanoid as a messenger. And so just keep that in the back of your head.
Hold that, yes.
When we get back to Mothman.
Put a pin in that. That's going to be important later. And you may, if you've encountered anything about angelology or the study of angels, you may have heard of the cherubim and the seraphim. And these are actually taken directly out of the Bible. Most of what we know about angels from a Christian perspective actually doesn't come from the Bible. It's from, related writings.
A lot of other texts.
A lot of other
Tons
things.
of other texts.
Yes. And there is a really nice line in Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, where it says, above him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces. With 2 they covered their feet. And with 2 they were flying. And so we see this kind of repetition of this idea of having multiple pairs.
And that's been depicted in artwork
all over the place.
All over the place. And angelology has been a part of artwork, I think,
since at least the medieval period.
Yeah,
since at least the medieval period.
It's really been a huge part of it. And you see these winged creatures, and we talk about angels with winged creatures. We talk about demons sometimes as winged creatures. Yep. If you think about the idea of demons as fallen angels, obviously that's
naturally right,
kind of where it goes. But again, that's another thing to remember as we talk through some of the things with Mothman, because there's one particular story about Mothman and why Mothman exists related to the Point Pleasant sightings that really has to do with him being a demon as part of a curse. So, this all does kind of tie together, even though
more than you would think.
Loosely in some cases, but as you think more and more through it, there's a lot of interesting things that do tie together.
And so with that, we wanted to kind of give you a sense of how this idea of winged humanoids doesn't just exist within the Mothman lore, right? It doesn't start with the Mothman lore. It also doesn't end with the Mothman lore, but we'll get to that in a second. So we wanted to kind of leave you with that context to kind of think about, the broader ideas of, why do we see humans depicting people or things that look like people with wings, and it could just be as simple as humans throughout history have been like,
I want to fly.
I can't fly. Those birds got wings and that looks like fun, and, then we're off to the races. But there also could be more to this, right? And so we wanted to kind of think about that in the context of Mothman.
Or maybe it's aliens.
Or maybe it's aliens. It could always be. It's always aliens right now. It's so much aliens.
There's so much alien stuff right now, but that's okay.
Yes. So with that said, what about Mothman? Why is Mothman the most famous winged humanoid ever? What should we know about Mothman, Chris?
Well, let's start with the 1960s, because that's where everybody tends to start, is with the Point Pleasant sightings. But what's interesting is they didn't start in Point Pleasant. So I do want to point that out first. This series of sightings began, most people date it from November 15th. They actually started November 12th in 1966. And this was in Clendenin, West Virginia, and I may be mispronouncing that, but that's what I'm going to go with. Clendenin, West Virginia. There were 5 grave diggers working in a cemetery. And forgive the language that I'm about to use, because
it's not that bad.
It's not that bad, but it's not
We
great.
don't have to bleep anything out, so it's not
No,
that
no, no.
bad.
But there's five grave diggers working in a cemetery, and they see, and I quote, a brown human being. But this brown human being launches itself from the trees in which it was sitting, standing, whatever,
Mhm.
with wings and goes straight up, gliding over their heads. And so that's odd. You don't normally see a person doing that,
And
brown or otherwise.
I was gonna say I can't say I've seen a brown, a white, a gray human being do any of those things.
Yeah.
The
So,
thing, the thing that's interesting too, before we move on from Clendenin, is that that's almost an hour away from Point Pleasant.
yeah,
And we're
yeah,
gonna we're gonna talk about some other things that are really key to, I'm gonna call it the Mothman mythos, that happen in the region of Point Pleasant.
right,
And we're
right,
talking like an hour radius around Point Pleasant, not just Point Pleasant
right.
itself.
It's not just Point Pleasant. It's not just that bridge.
No, no, it's not.
Okay, so you had this November 12th sighting. Then you hit the November 15th sightings, and that's where a lot of this really, really starts.
Mhm.
So Bandit, Bandit is a German Shepherd, or was a German Shepherd.
Was a German Shepherd. Maybe still is a German Shepherd. We don't know.
Well, they did find a dog carcass at one point,
Oh, okay, you're
so
right. They did.
probably
You're
not.
right. So probably.
This was 1966, so
I don't know, man.
that's an old dog.
Maybe he got beamed up. You know, I don't know.
So Bandit was Newell Partridge's German Shepherd in Salem, West Virginia. Salem, I believe, is closer to Point Pleasant. So Newell Partridge is sitting at home on the evening of November 15th, and he's watching TV, as one does. And his television goes dark, and he starts hearing this sort of loud humming. He describes it as either a humming or whining sound. And this is concerning to him. And then his dog starts barking. So he gets up and he looks outside. The dog goes outside. Or maybe the dog was already outside. I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, he looks outside and he looks off towards the barn, which is what his dog is barking at, is something in the area of the barn. And so he looks at the barn and he sees two large red circles that he describes as like bicycle reflectors by the barn, kind of spaced like eyes would be spaced. And then the dog takes off towards the barn. And as the dog goes to the barn, Newell Partridge hears the dog barking and then yelping and whining and then silence. So you know nothing good happened there. So then he goes to the barn to see what's going on, and he sees the dog prints kind of in the snow because it's, you know,
It's November. There's snow on the ground.
snow, mud, whatever, kind of there. And he sees the dog prints, and the dog prints are kind of going in a circle, and then they're just gone. And so this thing with the red eyes took the dog,
Presumably.
presumably. So later that night, there are two couples driving outside of Point Pleasant in what's called the TNT area. And so the TNT area is now known as McClintock Wildlife Management Area. It was the site of a former World War II munitions plant. It has concrete igloos formerly used to store explosives. So it's kind of interesting area. But so Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallett are driving around. And, most people don't really talk about what were they doing. They're just these two couples out driving.
Driving in the middle of nowhere.
Roger was driving. And it turns out they wanted to drag race. They were looking for a place to drag race. They wanted to drive really fast. And they wound up driving fast that night.
They did, but not for the reasons they intended.
But not for drag racing. So they're in this area, they're driving around, and they see a creature that they describe as 6 or 7 feet tall, having a wingspan of about 10 feet, and big red eyes that are about 2 inches in diameter and 6 or so inches apart. So big red circular eyes, similar to what Partridge saw.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so they see this, and this is taken from the Point Pleasant Register, which is a newspaper, published about this the next day. I mean, it was a kind of a big deal.
Yep.
So they see this, and it takes off, again, straight up in the air, which this is a really interesting piece of what you hear about Mothman. He takes off straight up in the air, which is not the way that
Birds
normally.
fly.
That's just not the way
Definitely
things
not
happen.
birds fly.
So they see him take off, and they're scared at this point because they don't know what this is. And so they start leaving.
That's a big
They're
bird.
driving, they spin the car around, they're going fast, and they start to hit, almost, or they say about 100 miles an hour
Hmm.
as they're driving. And this thing flies with them. So, it goes straight up and then comes with them in the direction that they're going. And they're going fast. And this thing is keeping up with them without a problem, not flapping its wings.
Hmm.
And so that's really interesting. That is not how you think of birds. They also, interestingly, describe hearing a squeaking or mechanical humming sound. So again, that goes back to what Partridge was hearing as well.
Yeah. Hmm.
So this all happens in the same night. And needless to say, they're not really in a good place mentally after
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, you
unhappy.
can read the whole article. We'll send it, or we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
It's interesting reading a firsthand account and
Okay.
knowing that it was in the
Lucky.
newspaper the next day because we don't
Yeah.
get anything cool like that in the newspaper anymore.
No, and it was the next day. And back
Right,
then, this happened at night.
right.
And it was in the newspaper the next day. So this was big news
Hmm.
for it
Hmm.
to get to the newspaper that
Right.
quickly. So those were not the only sightings. Over the next 13 months. So this was not, a short time period. This is over a year. There are over 100 sightings of this same creature. Some of them a little bit more descriptive than others, all of them at different times of day. I mean, there's a lot of different things that are discussed, but there's some commonalities to what people are reporting. The shape of the body. They're seeing this body and there's no neck. There's just the head is kind of squished down
Mhm.
into the body and the eyes are just right there and the wings come out of the back, but there's no defined head, which
Mhm.
is that's an odd shape.
Right.
So that's a little bit different from when you think of what a human would look like. You hear about black or brown in color, large wings, very large wingspan, and these red glowing eyes. The red glowing eyes are a big, big piece of this. Everybody who sees this thing is not comfortable when they see it.
Right.
It scares them.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of discussion of like feelings of dread when you
Yeah.
see Mothman, and that continues with contemporary sightings, which we'll get to in a
Yeah.
second.
And I mean, you had this one woman, Marcella Bennett, who sees it and almost drops her infant daughter. I mean, this is
Yeah,
shocking.
that takes a lot.
Yeah, she's in such shock, and she recovered the baby, and everything was cool.
Yeah.
But still, this is showing people get scared. So the sightings stop immediately after the collapse of the Silver Bridge.
Hmm.
And so that occurred December 15th, 1967. So again, 13 months of these sightings were going on. And this was a horrible tragedy. Let's start there. There were 46 people killed. Two of the bodies were never even recovered. 32 vehicles were lost in the river.
Hmm.
This was bad. And the reason it collapsed, I'm just going to read what it is because I don't understand bridge construction. So it
Not
was,
an architect, anthropologists, not
yeah,
architects
it
here.
was a failure of I-bar 330. It was a cleavage fracture in the lower part of its eyelet at joint C13N. This was all due to stress corrosion and corrosion fatigue. It was an older bridge.
Yes.
That's what I got
It
out of
was
it.
old and corroded,
And it
like
had a
many of our
failure.
bridges currently are.
Yes. And it had a failure and the whole thing collapsed. And it collapsed right in the middle of rush hour. It
Hmm.
was it was horrible. It was a terrible tragedy. But right after that, nobody saw Mothman again.
Hmm.
And that's where a lot of the myth surrounding what Mothman is comes from. And that's why I said to remember things like messenger.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of people out there who think or talk about Mothman being sort of the messenger saying something bad was going to happen because the sightings then stopped.
Hmm.
So that's interesting. I don't know if that's what it means,
Hmm.
but the sightings did stop.
Yeah.
So, Ryan, why don't you tell us a little bit about John Keel?
Yeah. So John Keel is really the guy who we can point to as the reason why we are still talking about Mothman, I think. I feel pretty comfortable saying that. So, John Alva Keel was a journalist and ufologist. He was born in 1930 and passed in 2009. In his obituary in the Telegraph, he was described as, quote, one of ufology's most widely read and influential authors, end quote. And you may be familiar with John Keel, even if you don't follow too much of the Mothman story from the book, The Mothman Prophecies, and later the film. So he's the author of the Mothman Prophecies. And he spent much of 1966 and 67, around the time when all of these sightings are happening, traveling in the Point Pleasant region, investigating Mothman sightings, UFO sightings, and all manner of other strange happenings that were going on in this part of the
That's
United States.
something to think about, right? It wasn't just Mothman sightings
No.
that were going on in this area. There were other things happening too.
Yes.
So a lot of weird stuff was happening in West Virginia.
Yes. And I will say he was not the first to write about Mothman, or Mothman's apparent or assumed association with the Silver Bridge collapse. So before Mothman Prophecies is published in 1975, Gray Barker, who is a something of an associate of his, they have a sort of interesting relationship that's kind of beyond what we're going to talk about today. But if you want to know more about Gray Barker, there's a new book that came out this year called The Saucerian that's about him and his life and all of his writings because he's a prolific writer. Publishes in 1970 a book called The Silver Bridge, which was published in kind of his own personal newsletter slash magazine thing. And so it's not nearly as widely read.
But you can get that book
Yes.
now. John Keel actually helped get it all
Republish it.
published,
Hmm.
republished,
Yeah.
and you can now get it anywhere.
And there's a lot of overlap between the two stories, right?
Mhm.
I haven't read The Silver Bridge, but Chris has, and we were kind of talking about, you were saying it's kind of similar, it's more about
It's a
the actual
story.
cases.
Yeah,
It's like, oh, this sighting and this is how it happened and this is who it happened to.
and it's written very much in a story kind of
Yeah.
format, which is a little bit different than
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Gray Barker really inserts himself into that story very much.
a little bit. I mean, he's there,
But I mean, in
but
comparison to Mothman Prophecies,
yeah,
like
yeah,
John Keel is almost the main character of his own book in some sense.
yeah.
And so the Mothman Prophecies, I think, in kind of in my opinion, is maybe one of, if not the most influential and popular nonfiction books about the paranormal ever. I suggest it to anyone who has never read about the paranormal and wants to read something about it. I suggest the Mothman Prophecies not only because of its massive influence, but I think it's also an interesting or fun read. I think it's, you're just following John Keel through all of these
If you've
wild
seen the
rabbit
movie,
holes.
might as well,
Yeah, and if you've seen the movie, yeah, I mean, I would highly recommend the film as well.
Sure.
It's not a perfect adaptation, but it's good. I
What
think
film
it's
is?
solid. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Um, Now, I think what's kind of interesting for us in this discussion around Mothman and the broader winged humanoid phenomenon is that in the Mothman prophecies, and because of his sort of experiences throughout this investigation around Mothman and everything going on in Point Pleasant, he starts to kind of put together what becomes known as his ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. And so you can read more about this specifically in two books that he writes later called Operation Trojan Horse and The Eighth Tower. But to put it very simply, this is a unitary theory of the paranormal that argues that entities like aliens, cryptids, ghosts, pretty much anything that can fall under that paranormal umbrella are able to manipulate energies, whether they be electromagnetic or otherwise, or exist on whole other energetic dimensions that we aren't able to perceive at this point, or we don't perceive readily. And one thing to note when he talks about this ultra terrestrial hypothesis is he kind of talks about this idea that balls of light are often described in paranormal encounters in general. So, I mean, I'm sure if you follow any of the ghost and haunting literature, people talk about seeing lights all the time. If you follow some of the more, I guess we'll call it woo, that's what it's called in the community. If you follow more of the woo or high strangeness Bigfoot literature, there's lots of balls of light described around Bigfoot encounters as well.
There's also a lot of geological anomalies
Yeah,
that talk about balls of light that we don't
yeah,
understand,
yeah,
that sort of arise from the ground or in the air, things like that,
yeah.
and we don't understand them.
And these are kind of described in this ultra-terrestrial hypothesis by Keel as these entities sort of natural forms. This is how they naturally occur to us or are visible to us naturally. And then they can, manipulate the way that they are perceived. Now, again, this is not an episode about the ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, so I would, recommend you take a look at Trojan Horse and the Eighth Tower to kind of get a deeper dive in that. But I wanted to kind of put that in here because it's important for understanding Keel's overall idea about what Mothman is and what the phenomenon is
What was happening
and what
specifically
was
in Point
happening
Pleasant.
in Point Pleasant, and there's lots of things lots of terms that Keel coins throughout his research, like window areas and things like that. And these all many of them have their roots in his experiences around Mothman. Now, some of the other sort of weirdness that he encounters or records in this time around Point Pleasant are some things that have kind of stuck with us in the
And this is
paranormal.
Gray Barker talks about these same things
Yeah,
too. So
yeah,
again, it's not just
yes,
Keel.
yes.
And I think that's important because, if it's one person, you kind of have to say, well,
Well, they could just be writing some weird
right,
stuff.
they
Yeah,
just but there's a lot in the Silver Bridge book by Gray Barker also that really correlates.
yeah,
And they didn't originally know each other. They wound up knowing each other. But when
yes.
they first started doing this, it wasn't like they, colluded and said, let's go
No,
get
yeah,
rid of
right,
it.
exactly. They were not working together in this
Right,
process, right? Or at least as far as we know today.
right.
And so one of these examples is about an entity that goes by the name of Indrid Cold. And if you are familiar at all with the Hellier series, you will be familiar with this story. If you're not, I recommend it. Chris isn't the biggest fan, but I would recommend checking it out because it's interesting nonetheless, and it's a fun little rabbit hole to get down. But to give you kind of the sort of overall idea of Indrid Cold and why we care, in early November of 1966. So we're talking right before all of the Mothman sightings start happening in Parkersburg, West Virginia. A guy by the name of Woodrow Derenberger.
And Parkersburg is about 55 miles
Yeah,
from Point Pleasant. So
yeah.
we're talking about that real small
Big
area.
area. I mean,
Okay.
big but small. Well, okay, I grew up in a small town, so that's a big area for me. But
When I say a small area, you're not talking about the whole country.
correct,
You're
correct.
talking about
It's localized,
it's
but not
localized.
localized to Point Pleasant
Right.
specifically. Yeah, yeah. And so Woodrow Derenberger, he's a salesman. He's driving home from work on highway, and an oblong-shaped UFO lands in front of him. And
It's interesting because he talks about it being behind him at first,
yes,
and
he
then
sees
kind of
it behind
flying
him,
over him, and
flies over
then
him.
lands in front of him,
Yes.
which makes me sort of think like, I'm glad you didn't hit anything.
Yeah, yeah, and
It's a weird description.
he describes it kind of as the shape of like the globe on a kerosene lantern, right? So it's kind of, bigger and more bulbous on the one end and comes kind of to a point on the other end. And he says that after it lands in front of him and he obviously pulls his car over, he sees a humanoid being that exits this craft and approaches his car and starts asking him questions about things like they could see the city of Parkersburg in the distance. And he asked, what is that? And he was like, well, it's Parkersburg. And telling him, that he shouldn't be scared and that he's quoted, he says, Indrid Cold says, quote, "We come from a country that is not nearly as powerful as yours. We mean you no harm," end quote. And the interesting thing about this, for anyone who is steeped in the UFO literature and the extraterrestrial literature, is that he communicates all of this telepathically. And so if you read any of the abductee accounts, that's very common for people to say, "Oh, I had this encounter, I was abducted, and they told me all this stuff without actually telling me this stuff."
And just for clarity, Indrid Cold is not a winged humanoid.
Correct.
He's a
Correct. Yeah.
humanoid figure,
Yes.
but not
No
winged.
wings. No wings.
Yeah.
And even though it's somewhat unconnected to the Mothman story, Woodrow Derenberger and his relationship with Indrid Cold doesn't end on that night. So later, he is reported to travel to Cold's planet, Lanulos, which is a whole story in and of itself. Later, he reports being visited by Indrid Cold's sons later in his life. And he wrote there's several books about him, and telling this whole story.
He forms a real relationship with Indrid Cold.
Yes.
This is not like a one-time
Right.
thing. It's a long relationship. And I mean, that in and of itself is interesting from the perspective of trying to understand people's interactions with what they believe are aliens.
Mhm.
You don't typically hear about relationships like that forming where there's communication and that.
Yeah, not often in the sense that like you don't get abducted, meet
Right,
an
right.
alien, they give you their name and address, and you guys become pen pals. I mean, there's some reports in some of the abductee literature of people saying they have a relationship with a specific, oftentimes it's a tall gray in the sort of abductee accounts, but it's not like this,
It's
where
not at all like this.
Indrid
It's
Cold's
like
like
unique.
besties with Woodruff Deerberger.
Yeah.
Like they're like friends.
Yeah, he's not being abducted. There are no medical tests being run on him. This
Yeah.
is just a friendship, which
Yeah.
really unusual.
Which is its own deep dive in and of itself, which we're not going to do today. And like you were saying before, this is reported in both Barker and Keel's work about Point Pleasant and about Mothman. And then the other thing that comes out of this that I think is most interesting for you, or you're really interested in it, is the idea of Men in Black. So
Great movies,
we
first of
can
all.
excellent movies.
You know.
But the idea of Men in Black as a paranormal phenomenon actually starts really with the Mothman story.
Yeah.
So Keel coins this term in a magazine publication in 1967 about his experiences investigating Mothman. And so we see in both the Silver Bridge and Mothman prophecies discussions about the Men in Black, what they are, this idea that they're possibly extraterrestrial or possibly governmental. There's lots of
It's interesting that it's unclear which of those two things
yes,
they
yeah,
are,
like it's
actually.
the way people describe them. So, for example, in the Mothman prophecies, Keel works with this woman by the name of Mary Hyre. She's a journalist for the Athens Reporter and does a lot of the investigative reporting with Keel. So, oftentimes he's going out and following up on UFO sightings or oh, everybody saw a UFO off of this mountain last week, and so everyone's going up to see it. He would get in the car with Mary and they'd both go up and check it out. And so she's throughout this whole story. And she's also reporting all these UFO sightings over that 13-month period and all of the strangeness that's happening in the Athens Reporter. And she reports at several points of encounters, or she reports at several points encounters with Men in Black, including in the immediate wake of the Silver Bridge collapse, where she was working on a story about UFO sightings, and this is right after the bridge collapse. Everybody's going through it. She's had in the book she describes she's had family members in and out of her office all day, people trying to find out who's missing and who's not, who's passed and who's not. And at one point, these two men who she describes as looking almost like twins in black suits come in, and oftentimes, and I think in this case is true as well, they're kind of described as like not really, like their body movements are weird,
Yeah.
and they don't quite move like you expect humans to move.
They're very unusual in terms of not just the way they move, but they seem uncomfortable.
Yeah, they seem uncomfortable, and the way they speak is oftentimes awkward and not, almost as if they don't speak fluent English.
Right.
And there's some very odd descriptions of them that are kind of, we would consider them, I think, at best off color in 2025.
Yeah.
But, she reports, that they show up in her office. She's like, has anybody, or the Men in Black are, asking her, has someone ever told you not to publish those? And what would you do if someone told you not to publish these? Referring to stories about UFO sightings. And she's like, I still publish them. And then she kind of just like moves on and like ignores them. And then she looks up from her desk and they're gone.
Yeah. And sometimes you'll hear it's just a phone call
Yes.
with this awkward sort of speech pattern. And maybe it's just awkward people.
And that's and okay, and so that's, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's an interesting piece about weird phone calls in the Mothman prophecies, particularly in relationship to Gray Barker and John Keel. So John Keel throughout the book starts reporting feeling like someone is monitoring his phone calls at multiple points, mostly later in the book. And he starts talking about, hearing people on the other line, hearing these weird clicking sounds, getting these weird phone calls from people that he perceives to be the Men in Black, telling him not to publish things or whatever. And it's interesting because some research on Gray Barker, and, if you dig into John Keel a little bit more, there is some suggestion that, and even Keel even does this in the Mothman prophecies, he suggests that maybe those phone calls are Gray Barker just like messing with him. And there is some evidence that suggests that may have been happening. but the Men in Black stories still persist because, I mean, they certainly didn't just exist in the context of Mothman.
Right.
People still have, Mothman. People still have Men in Black sightings, and report them in relationship with UFO sightings as
And
well.
again, it's really all about, don't talk about this.
Right.
That's what this
Right.
always seems to be about, is
Hmm.
cover this up.
Yeah.
And so that's why some people go immediately to this, well, it's the government,
Right.
because the government wants to cover things up. And other people go towards, well, maybe it's the aliens trying to
Hmm.
cover it up themselves.
Hmm.
And I think either theory has, possible conclusions. I don't know
Yeah.
the right words,
Explanations.
but
Yeah.
explanations. But, I do think there's something to this idea of the Men in Black and who are they?
Hmm.
What are they doing? Because too many people talk about them
Right. Right.
for it to be nothing.
Hmm. And so that's kind of the story with Mothman in terms of kind of the story of what happened in and around Point Pleasant. Now, those aren't the only reported Mothman sightings in general, and keeping with that idea that Mothman sightings may be in themselves sort of omens of misfortune, there are a handful or a few post Point Pleasant sightings that meet the criteria for Mothman. And Chris, do you want to talk about those a little bit?
So, first of all, we have in 1986, we have the Blackbird of Chernobyl. So, I'm assuming everybody knows what Chernobyl was all about. Um, but to go back to April of 18, April of 1986, rumors started circulating among workers at the nuclear power plant in the Ukraine. At the time, it was the USSR. And what these rumors were about was this large, headless black bird with a 20-foot wingspan and red eyes that was flying over the cooling towers of the reactor, specifically reactor 4. Reactor 4, of course, is the one that exploded, and
Hmm.
we had all kinds of
Detonator.
problems
Yeah.
from that. So these were workers both in the control room and on the grounds that were reporting this
Hmm.
this bird flying around. Um, so the people who saw the creature reportedly had horrific nightmares and received threatening phone calls not to talk about the bird.
Spooky.
So, is that Men in Black? I don't know.
Mhm.
On the morning of April 26th, just after the reactor exploded, the workers who survived that initial blast claimed to see that same black shape circling in the sky above the explosion through the radioactive plume and kind of seeing everything, kind of looking at everything from
Hmm.
above,
Hmm.
doing a survey. And so it became known as the Blackbird of Chernobyl. So that sounds an awful lot like Mothman sightings.
Hmm. A little bit.
Um, so, is it the same thing? I don't know, but it does sound an awful lot like them. Then fast forward to 2011 in Fukushima. And so Fukushima was another disaster.
Hmm.
So this is less documented than Chernobyl. But after there was an earthquake, there were stories following the Tohoku earthquake, and the earthquake led to a tsunami. So this was an earthquake and tsunami in Japan. And there's, lots of things happen when you have an earthquake.
Hmm.
And one of the terrible things that can happen is your nuclear power plants get a little messed up.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a really bad
It could be
thing.
better. Could be better.
So there were some problems with the nuclear. It wasn't quite like Chernobyl, but again, it was problems with the
There
nuclear
was
reactor.
damage to the
Damaged the
reactor. Yeah.
reactor. People who kind of saw what was going on, they saw something flying over this area. Again, where there was a nuclear disaster. The descriptions were a little bit different. They were very much wraith-like.
Hmm.
It's a little bit more human looking,
Sure.
but a dark winged silhouette that kind of sat on top of the debris watching. So in this
Hmm.
case, it's not before the disaster, it's nothing like that, but during the disaster, in the immediate aftermath, they saw something. So that's not exactly the same as foretelling, being a messenger, but again, associated with a disaster. And that's kind of bothersome that, this is associated with all these disasters.
Yeah, and I think that's like the sticking point for some people with these two particular accounts is that, they weren't, it wasn't like people were having sightings for 13 months
Right.
leading up to
Right.
both of these, right? And so
Now in
these
Chernobyl,
stories.
there were sightings pre,
Mhm,
but it was
mhm.
really within a few weeks.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that no one was really talking about them until after the disaster happened. And so there's a
Yeah.
lot of question about like,
Is
what
that
does that
real?
mean? Is it real?
Right. Right.
Things like that. I mean, in my opinion, though, I mean, I do think that there is a little bit of an overemphasis on this whole omen aspect with Mothman,
But
even
I think it's
though
because it's interesting to
I
think
think
about.
I think it's interesting. It tells a really good
It
story.
does.
I
It really
mean,
does.
and I think some of it comes back to, I mean, Gray Barker's book is called The Silver Bridge. So I mean,
Yes.
I mean, it's kind of, that you can't lose that association there, right?
Right.
And I mean,
Right.
Keel's book is the Mothman Prophecies. So,
Right. Uh,
I think
so
so. I
there
think
was
there's
clearly
some
a thought that there was something,
something, yeah,
some sort of
yeah, and
messenger.
and like, and we've already said, if we want to put it into that broader context of winged humanoids, I mean, there is certainly an association with messengers and messages and things like that.
Right. But then moved to Chicago,
So.
and we're not seeing the same sort of messenger thing going on in
Yeah, no,
Chicago.
no.
But beginning in 2011
Hmm.
and then increasing in frequency over time through 2017, there have been a lot of sightings with Mothman
Hmm.
in the Chicago area, or what
Yep.
people are saying is Mothman. I really, can't say it is.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Things that are similar.
but there's no tie to a specific disaster.
Hmm. Before we get to that, I do want to take a slight detour to central Iowa just for a brief second
Central Iowa.
because I mean, as someone who was born in Iowa and someone who grew up in very small towns, I can really appreciate some small town weirdness. And there is, one some I think unappreciated cryptozoological winged humanoid phenomena in Van Meter, Iowa, that I think more people should know about. And I want to give a big shout out to Tobias Wayland and Richard Estep in their book because they spend a whole chapter talking about what's known as the Van Meter visitor. And I just loved this chapter. I thought it was awesome. But and I want to, tell people a little bit about it because I think one thing that I really like about their book, we're like harping on books right now, is that
We read a lot.
we read a lot and we have some news that we'll share at the end of the episode. But one thing that I really like about their book is they talk about this winged humanoid phenomena in this really broad sense. They don't spend a lot of time talking about, the prehistoric or the historic stuff, but, they do have a lot of examples throughout specifically US history talking about like these winged humanoid things that we've seen or people have seen.
And Van Meter and Chicago, both of them
Yeah,
made.
exactly. And so Van Meter, Iowa, it's a really small town, population of 1,500, west of Des Moines. Des Moines is the capital of Iowa, in case you didn't know. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's not a lot in Iowa. It's a lot of cornfields. But in September of 1903, there's a period of 5 days where some really weird stuff was going down in Van Meter. So starting on the 28th, a farm implement dealer in town sees what he describes as a bright ball of light. So remember what we said before, over the top of a building. Now, subsequently, the light disappears and then reappears on a roof of another nearby building. He's a little confused by this, but fine, whatever. It's weird. He initially, I think the reports are initially he thought someone was like trying to break into one of the buildings or something like that. Now, the next night, a local physician is awoken by yet another bright light that he says was coming from the head of a large bat winged humanoid. So he does what any good Midwestern boy does, and he pulls out his pistol and shoots at it. But apparently doesn't do any damage. So either as Estep and Wayland say, either he was a really bad shot or this creature didn't it didn't affect the creature at all. But it freaks him out so much that he barricades himself into his house until the morning. So I mean that says something to me. You've got I mean it's your local small town physician in 1903,
I
but
mean, do we have any psychological reports on this guy?
we don't. But it was 1903, okay? I mean it's 1903 and it was rural Iowa. Like no shade at rural Iowa, but it's a little weird out there. So then on the next night on the 30th, we have a banker who was working overnight at the bank as a security guard and he sees a bright light shining through the bank window. He decides he's going to shoot first and ask questions later. He shoots his shotgun
It's a lot
through
of
the
shooting
window.
involved here.
Yeah, man,
All
it's
right.
reliable. What do you want? And so he shoots through the window, blows out the glass, doesn't see anything. However, later a set of three-toed footprints is found, left behind, and they are cast from right under where that window is. Now, of course, conveniently, there's no record of what happened to these casts. No one knows where they're at. As far as I know, there's no photos of them or anything like that, which is a real bummer. Now, the following night, so this is really like 5 crazy nights in Van Meter, a hardware store owner, and this is where it gets really interesting, awakes up to the sound of what he describes as something similar to metal files or rasps being rubbed
So
together.
we're back to some sort of metallic
Very weird
sound. Yeah.
metallic sound, and it's a hardware store owner, so like that description is like he knows what that sounds like.
Right. Right.
And he wakes up, and from his window, he sees what we now know as the Van Meter visitor, either resting or sleeping on a telephone pole near his window. And we're talking like 15, 20 feet from his
And
window.
I think this is the only report that certainly that I know of where we're seeing a winged humanoid or Mothman or whatever this is asleep.
Sleeping, maybe. Yes, like chilling, just vibing. And he also decides to fire upon the Van Meter visitor. And so this Van Meter visitor is like 50 Cent. He's like taking 9 shots and he's fine. And it looks directly at him, shines a light that is emitted from his head, and also emits what the hardware store owner describes as like a foul smelling odor that he reports caused a little bit of amnesia. So he is a little wishy washy on some of these details, apparently. Now, that in and of itself would be like, okay, well, that's kind of weird. You're saying you don't really remember. But his neighbors woke up from the gunshot because now this is like night 4 of gunshots in Van Meter. So like everybody's
And
like,
it's a small
what
town, so,
is happening, right? And his neighbors wake up from the gunshot and report seeing the Van Meter visitor descend to the telephone pole and then do this weird sort of hop away from the town, similar to like a kangaroo.
So it doesn't fly
So
away.
it's not flying away. So maybe
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 he's
all these
injured.
shots went through the wings. Who knows? So after this, everyone's getting together and thinking, all right, well, we can't have people just shooting at stuff every night in town. This is crazy. And so the following night, which is now the 1st of October, the townspeople figure out that the visitor and reportedly a second smaller entity, which some people suspect could have been like offspring, appear to be living in a mine on the outskirts of town. Now, it's somewhat unclear to me how they figured out that he's in the mine, but fine.
So what do you do?
You stake out the mine with all your guns, obviously. You get all those guys together and all their friends. And so they decide to stake it out. And just before dawn, the visitor and its companion return and are greeted with a hail of gunfire. Now, seemingly unfazed by all of these gunshots, they retreat into the mine shaft. And the townspeople are like, all right, well, that was a lot. So they decide that they should at least trap the visitor if they're unable to kill it and decide to board up the mine shaft. Now, some stories
So if you
report,
can't kill it quickly, kill it
yes, just
slowly.
kill it slowly. Well, some stories suggest that they blew up the entire entrance altogether and basically caused a cave in. Sure.
Okay, so does anybody still wonder why any of these things, cryptids, aliens, whatever, don't want us to see them and don't want to interact with us?
Yeah, you know. Well, and I think too, like to get back to the ultra terrestrial hypothesis too, if they exist on this electromagnetic dimension plane, however we want to describe it, who's to say that like physical gunshots would do anything to them in the first place?
True,
If they're not some sort of physical corporeal entity in the way that we are, right?
true.
And there have been some sightings of the Van Meter visitor, some things that have been reported, but nothing super definitive, nothing at all like the 5 Nights of Terror in Van Meter in the September of 1903. But there are some suggestions that perhaps there was another exit or another entrance to the mine shaft. They could have gone out, something like that, or they could still be alive in there. Who knows? Now, to come back to Chicago.
Right. So Chicago, you had 2011, you started having quite a few sightings there.
Yes.
And all the way up through 2017, and there's been over 100 sightings.
Yes. Yeah, and so if you want to understand what's going on in Chicago and in the broader Lake Michigan area when it comes to winged humanoids, you need to look no further than Tobias Whalen's Singular Fortean Society. He is doing an excellent job, in my opinion, of cataloging all of these sightings and researching them too. He's a former MUFON investigator. He's been featured on a bunch of shows. Most importantly to this episode, there's an Unsolved Mysteries episode on Netflix about winged humanoids that deals a lot with sightings that he's cataloged, sightings that he's investigated. He's also in the episode. And so we would highly recommend that. And he's put together a whole timeline of all of these sightings that's available on his website, which is linked in the show notes. Now, one of the things that I want to point out, because this is hundreds of sightings, and we're not going to sit here and just go through all hundreds of sightings, is because that's a lot. We're trying to keep these under 2 hours, Chris. Come on. And so, one of the things that I found most interesting about the sightings that he reports in his book with Richard Estep is that there were sightings that are in and around O'Hare International Airport. Now, if you've ever flown into Chicago, more than likely you've flown into O'Hare. And
Or
if you've
spent hours and hours delayed there,
some
as I
time
have.
delayed in O'Hare, and if you know anything about it, you know that it is absolutely massive airport. It's huge. I remember the first time I was in O'Hare, I had to like go to a different terminal, and I did not have very much time. It was a wild experience.
I have run through that airport,
Yeah,
like sprinted.
it's a lot. I was lucky we got a shuttle. It was fine. But I think what's important to note is that knowing how large of an airport that is, there are somewhat regular sightings of weirdness, whether they be
Sure.
UFOs or winged humanoids there. And
And the FAA always blames the weather.
they do, man. They really do. So one of the biggest sightings, or one of the most well-known sightings, happened back in 2006, where 12 United Airlines employees and a bunch of other witnesses claimed to see a large disc-shaped object over the airport. Now, of course, as you just said, the FAA blames the weather. I would like to assume that United employees, now maybe they were ground crew, I don't know, but I would like to assume that people who fly airplanes for a living can discern a cloud from something else.
I hope so.
For our sake, for the sake of all of us who fly in an airplane. I hope that you can tell when something is a cloud and something is not.
You know, as an aside, it always amazes me how they try to say that pilots don't know what they're looking at.
And this happens with the UFO stuff constantly.
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 I mean, these pilots, commercial pilots, Air Force
They literally
pilots.
spend their day in the air,
Right.
flying around.
Like, oh, you mistook that for something else. Really?
Right.
Or do we have that little faith in the people flying our planes? Because then we shouldn't be in the planes.
And so O'Hare has reports of very weird sightings, including that UFO report, but also as recently as 2019, there have been multiple reports of red-eyed winged humanoids that look or sound or described as very similar to what we would think of as Mothman.
Though I've seen a lot that are described really sort of pterodactyl-like.
Yeah, you
In
get
the
some
Chicagoland
of you get some of
stuff, so-
that. You also get some of like more human with wings
Yeah,
descriptions, and that Unsolved Mysteries episode is really good for that because it kind of talks about those differences and gives you some examples. But some of these have been reported even to MUFON, and so it's not just things that are being reported to organizations that unfortunately most people probably don't know, like the Singular Fortean Society, but more well-known groups like MUFON. And I think there's room for discussion on, the way that big organizations like MUFON sort of work as a funnel for reports of things like this. And so O'Hare, as one of the many places in the Chicago area that has reports associated with it, is kind of described as one of these possible window areas, which John Keel describes as kind of these geographic locations where unusual events have occurred over and over again, century after century. And this is kind of built into his ultra-terrestrial hypothesis. And so all that's to say that, you have probably heard of Mothman, and you are probably somewhat familiar with the mid-century Mothman sightings, but Mothman is part of a much larger phenomenon that I think oftentimes gets overlooked. And so, with all of that said, Chris, what do we think any of this could be?
Psychosis.
So, okay, now we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that.
I mean, it could be.
It could be, but we would all have to be collectively losing it, which we
That
might
thing.
be, but
Um, so there's a lot of different options for what it is. And I'm going to start, there is this idea that it's a cryptid,
mhm,
and that's a flesh and blood being.
right.
Um, but I'm going to start with the curse, just
Okay,
because
yeah, chronologically that makes
yeah,
that's a good
because
place
it
to
goes
start.
back to Point Pleasant.
Yes, yeah.
So when people started thinking about what was going on in Point Pleasant, one of the things that came up was that there was this Shawnee chief named Chief Cornstalk. And back in the day, he was jerked around, shockingly, by the US Army.
Unsurprisingly.
Yeah, I know that never happens, right? So he winds up getting killed. But before he gets killed, he supposedly placed a curse on the area, which would include this whole area
Hmm.
surrounding Point Pleasant.
Hmm.
And so there is this idea that maybe Mothman is from this curse. Maybe Mothman was not trying to warn people of the bridge collapse. Maybe Mothman was demonic in
And
nature
caused it.
and caused it.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's one place to start. That's kind of a dark place to
It's a place to
start.
start.
But why not start with an Indian curse?
Sure, because
Let's
we're gonna start with the trope. That's
let's
what
start with
other
the
one to
trope.
start with.
But I do think that, what that brings up is the idea is Mothman evil?
Right. Right.
Was this winged being there to cause
Right.
this problem?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, if you go through a lot of the Chicago and Lake Michigan area sightings, that's something that's really common is these like feelings of dread and like intense fear
Right.
when
So
someone encounters
if they're
them.
seeing
Yeah.
Mothman and they're feeling fear, maybe this is something demonic. I mean, that's still a winged humanoid.
Hmm.
And maybe that's where we're at.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, we could, if we want to take a step back to our sort of prehistoric examples, right? We mentioned that, well, maybe people just thought it would be cool to fly and decided to draw people with
It would be
wings.
flying.
I
It would
mean, my
fly.
3-year-old draws lots of wild stuff, so like a human with wings wouldn't be that weird, right? But building on that a little bit, because some of these examples are petroglyphs and cave art, we could venture a guess or an interpretation of something along the lines of David Lewis Williams' suggestions in his book, The Mind in the Cave, that we can interpret Paleolithic rock art and cave art through the lens of shamanic trance via ethnographic analogy. So basically, we're comparing to people who make rock art today and comparing motifs found both in that contemporary art and in historic cave art. Now, that would require that all of these sightings are happening because of an altered state of consciousness. And based on
The opioid epidemic wasn't real big yet.
that's true, it was not. And even beyond that, taking the breadth of reports of things that fall under this, winged humanoid umbrella, I mean, the United employees were not,
I really
in
hope
a
they weren't
trance state while they were
in a
seeing
conjoined
this.
trance state. I mean,
Right.
let's.
And I mean, they were seeing a UFO, but, I find it hard to believe that people who are just driving their cars, in a trance state, and so personally, I don't really feel like that holds water, but I think it's important to consider that in the context of, some of the prehistoric sightings or the prehistoric sightings, the prehistoric depictions of something that's a winged humanoid, right? Because some of those things that he talks about are things that we would kind of interpret as paranormal or supernatural or something. And so I think it's worth at least mentioning, right?
And it brings up a great topic for another episode, and that is consciousness
It does. It does. So
and
let us
altered
know
states of
in our
consciousness.
socials if
Yeah.
that's what you want us to talk about.
Yeah, I would love to talk
Chris
about
would
that.
love that.
Yeah. I can talk about that for days on
Yes.
it.
Yes.
And do sometimes when I teach.
You
So
do. It's true.
so what about mistaken identity? This one I struggle with.
Yeah, okay. So there was a researcher whose name I forget. I should name drop him because we can shame him. Who suggested that perhaps some of those original sightings could have been a migrating sandhill crane. These are large cranes, they're very big.
So
And
I mean,
they
yes, they're large in
they're
size,
large, they're gray,
but
but
they don't have big red eyes.
the red eye piece is weird. Although sandhill cranes do have a red patch of feathers on the side of their head.
Okay,
So there
so
is
there, yeah.
that. and like their coloration lines up and the timing also lines up. So I think that's where he comes at it from, is that they migrate during that period or would have been migrating
Do they eat German
in
shepherds?
November. I don't believe they eat dogs. I don't think so. I think the thing that falls apart for me with the sandhill cranes, because you could make the argument that like someone, because sandhill cranes don't like hang out in that region.
But I could believe that some people, I mean, there were over a
Right, that's
hundred
what I
sightings.
mean.
I
Right.
could argue that some of those people were seeing a sandhill crane, but you're telling me that every single one of those people, that's a lot of sightings, and some people who were seeing something very up close, and it doesn't
And the
explain
size doesn't line up.
the size, it
That's the
doesn't
piece for
explain
me.
some of the sounds that were heard. It Sandhill cranes do not take off straight up vertical
Hmm.
and fly 100 miles an hour without flapping their wings.
Not any crane I've ever seen.
So, I mean, the reality is it doesn't fit correctly. It may account for some of the sightings,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I really struggle with saying that all of those sightings were migrating
Yeah.
cranes. But
Yeah. And then, you know, maybe it's something else altogether. And I think honestly, for me, I think my entry point to the paranormal mostly was ghosts, but also was cryptids. I've always been into cryptids. Bigfoot's always been a, you know, an interest of mine. And I think over the last probably year or two, I've started to shift a lot in what I think cryptids are. And I think, you know, reading about Keel's ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, reading more about what's, you know, referred to as the high strangeness phenomena, which is, you know, paranormal experiences that are, you know, described as utterly bizarre, can't be classified or easily understood. You know, basically, if you hear stories about Bigfoot coming out of a UFO or UFOs in association with Bigfoot, that falls under this category, right? And that's a whole thing. I'm not even making a joke. Like, that's real. People talk about that. And so I think, you know, for me, all of these pieces, if we look at them all together, you know, it's very hard to classify. And so it does sort of meet that criteria as quote unquote high strangeness. And I think it's somewhat convenient
mhm.
to explain in that way, just because then it's like, oh, well, that's why we don't have bodies. That's why you
Right.
can't shoot them. And
Because
that's,
it's concerning that with
yeah,
all of these cryptids out there, we never find really remnants
good,
of
solid physical evidence. Yeah.
like
Yeah.
a dead body.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. We may get footprints, we may get trace things, but not not good solid evidence. No, that's irrefutable.
Yeah, and I don't know what Mothman is. I'm just going to say that very clearly that
Well, I don't
I
either, but
I don't know. I don't even know what camp I fall in terms of how to explain this. I will say that in my mind, we're not talking about one particular type of being, entity, animal, whatever, throughout all of these sightings because they're not similar enough to me.
true.
As I hear the different reports,
Hmm.
there are things that are very different.
Yeah.
And, you know, a pterodactyl is not what I picture in my mind when I hear the descriptions of Mothman.
Right.
And yet it is, you know, a descriptor that's used
Hmm.
certainly with some of the sightings in Chicago and elsewhere.
Hmm.
And so I look at that and I say, you know, to lump all of these together and say they're the same thing, I think is erroneous. I think
Hmm.
you need
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
allow for the idea that there are different things going on. So it's
Yeah.
possible that the Point Pleasant sightings can be explained at least partially as migrating sandhill cranes,
Sure.
but that Chernobyl can't.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Right.
You know, and so I think we have to allow for that and just say sometimes we as humans like to lump things together because it's a category we can talk about when maybe they're not all the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think Mothman is still, in my mind, a big question mark.
Hmm. So what do we have coming up, Chris?
We have an episode to stick with the aliens theme
Yeah, we're gonna come back to aliens.
because if you've been following our headlines from beyond, we've been
Hmm.
talking a lot about Three Eye Atlas
Hmm.
and the possibility for aliens. We figured why not do a whole episode
Yeah.
on that, and we're calling it xenoanthropology. So you want to say what we think that
Yeah.
means?
Yeah. So Xena, well, if you're a Star Trek fan, you know what it is.
That,
Um,
and I am a huge Star Trek fan. So
I'm not. I had to Google it, friends. But xenoanthropology is essentially, I'm more of a Star Wars guy myself. Xenoanthropology is essentially the idea of understand taking the principles of anthropology or the discipline of anthropology and applying it to extraterrestrial life. And so we're going to kind of dig into like what that would look like, what that would mean, how that could actually work.
And
Um,
what some of the species of
yeah,
aliens
and what some
are
of
that
the
people think
yeah,
are
so we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what some people have described as what the closest we can get to the culture of different alien groups based on abduction and contactee accounts. And so we're going to dig into that. It should be a fun episode. And to go along with that episode, we are kicking off a Beyond the Human book club. And so, if you've noticed, we've been just talking about books this episode. We could have done that for any other episode, really. This episode just kind of fit really nicely because there's some really solid
respect.
books
We
to
read a
reference.
lot.
Yeah, we read a lot, but this episode really had lots of good book references. But so we'll be reading a book or we'll actually be reading a short story to kick us
We'll
off.
start with a short story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're gonna kick off with a short story that is the basis for the film Arrival. So if you've ever seen that film, you may not know that it was actually based on a short story. And so we're gonna kick it off with that. So stay tuned on our social media for information about that, how you can read with us, how you can chat with us, and see what we thought about the book.
Yeah, and so we'll start doing some live things.
Yeah, yeah,
Hopefully, some of you will want to participate.
yes, exactly. Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Human, where the strange, the supernatural, and the deeply human collide. If today's journey into the unknown sparked your curiosity, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with fellow seekers of the extraordinary.
Have a story, question, or theory of your own? Reach out. We want to hear how the paranormal shapes your world, too. You can find us online at Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram.
Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep thinking beyond the human.